But to the fallout from the vote against The Voice on Saturday, the Prime Minister still is not getting the message. And some journalists, particularly on the ABC, are now calling no voters dumb or barely educated. And he's exploiting that too in a worrying way. Now, this giant tantrum is not just pathetic, it is dangerous. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese still can't accept that Australia said no to his whole agenda of racial separation. Now, 61% were against. Now, right, he does accept his voice is now dead, but he still won't promise to now scrap another key demand of the Uluru Statement that he promised to implement in full. It's this one, the Makarrata Commission, that is also spending money on, has already spent $500,000, to set up, to negotiate a treaty between Aborigines and the rest of us as if we're two warring people. A treaty about, sovereignty, for instance, and land, and of course, reparations. Well, here is the Prime Minister today, still toying with this racist and divisive agenda.
Will the Prime Minister be honest and upfront with Australians and inform the House whether or not he remains committed to a treaty and truth-telling process?
I will give respect to Indigenous Australians who have asked for a week to consider their position. I think that is pretty reasonable.
I can't believe what I'm hearing. Here is the Prime Minister still just doing the bidding of a bunch of Aboriginal radicals that sold him this stupid radical voice, wouldn't compromise. These guys, these radicals, are now off on their week of silence with their Aboriginal flags half-mast, a week of sulking, and we don't even know who they are. These are unnamed Aboriginal activists, and the Prime Minister says, I can't move, I can't decide until they tell me what to do. I mean, seriously, have you ever heard of anything like that in your life? This is not leadership. This is not democracy. The guy is a puppet. Now, I'd say, Prime Minister, you've got to listen to the voters. Don't listen to these unnamed activists off in their sook. No to racial division. The public was very clear about that. But meanwhile, we have journalists just trying to blame the defeat of The Voice on all those stupid, uneducated people. Here's Waleed Aly on Channel 10.
The biggest dividing line seems to have been education. So if you are in a seat that had high levels of tertiary education, a bachelor or postgrad, then you were at the very top end of the yes vote. And if you had the lowest levels of tertiary education, you were at the low end of the yes vote. And that's not to say people who are educated know what they're doing and people who don't have tertiary education don't. It's about the style of the message, I think.
If you thought that was a bit arrogant and high-handed and all that, well, the ABC's Patricia Karvelas was even more explicit this morning. The uneducated really were to blame.
The yes vote, if you look at it, has been achieved in places where voters have a bachelor's degree or have better than average wages, and where you find educated people who know, if you've got a bachelor's degree, chances are you know something about government, our structures. You've taken an interest in the kind of way these things happen, not because you're better, but just because you've got the opportunity to have done that, just to be clear. Like, I'm not judging people's achievements. It's just you've been able to find out lots of information.
Looking at that electoral map, there's actually a much simpler explanation. The areas that voted for The Voice were exactly the rich urban bits where the voters were least likely to meet Aborigines, Sydney's North Shore, for instance, or Canberra. And the places that voted against were often the poorer and remoter bits where you were most likely to actually meet Aborigines and see for yourself whether a voice would actually fix things, Northern Territory, for instance, and Cape York. It's a battle between ideology and observation one. People looking with their own eyes instead of dreaming like pink castles in rich urban areas. Now, it's exactly the same with global warming policies, by the way, same thing. Yeah, people in the cities in concrete going all green, people out in the countryside seeing these massive transition electricity wires and wind farms, they're against. But the other point about education, now, there is actually a saying that some things are so stupid that only intellectual could believe it. Communism, for instance, plenty of Marxists still in our universities, eugenics, now the ludicrous idea that global warming could wipe out humans or that men can be women. Well, a much smarter analysis of this referendum is that people who have power, people who are rich or plugged into government and the media, living in their big mansions, they can risk giving one racial group a little of their power because they reckon they can survive whatever could go wrong with the voice. They've got the ultimate power anyway. But people who are poor and really battling and they're on the margins of our cities or they're out bush and they're far away from all the levers of power and the media microphones, they haven't got any power to share. They're struggling to get ahead as it is. So don't go and tell them that some other group needs rights more than they do because, of their race. It won't work. But to this notion that stupid Australians voted against this voice, people tricked by misinformation. Let that myth take hold and it could have really dangerous political consequences, particularly when you've got a government thinking we were robbed by misinformation. Because guess what? Straight away, one of the pro-voice independents in Parliament was today demanding censorship.
Nothing protects voters from misleading and deceptive political advertising. Will you support my bill or introduce legislation without delay to provide voter protections in political advertising consistent with existing consumer protections?
I certainly understand her perspective because it is a concern with the changing media environment as well, that people can be the subject to misinformation.
Can you imagine what the Labor government, this Labor government and its bureaucratic allies could have done during the referendum campaign with the power to censor advertisements of the No campaign that they thought, misinformation. Joining me for Newswatch is Sophie Elsworth, media writer for the Australian newspaper. Sophie, thanks for your time. But Waleed Aly, all right, he can say whatever nonsense he likes. It's Channel 10 about dumb voters. I wonder how intelligent his audience is. But Patricia Karvelas, she is from the taxpayer-funded ABC, and that is meant to be impartial, isn't it?
Well, you would think so, Andrew, particularly because at the start of the year, all ABC editorial staff had impartiality training when it comes to the Voice referendum. But, Andrew, I think these remarks by Waleed and Patricia Karvelas are really offensive to a majority of Australians who voted no. And they seem to be not able to come to terms with the fact that there was a resounding no vote in this country. People did not want this. And now it's come down to really, I think, quite insulting takeouts from this, that if you don't have a bachelor's degree or you haven't sat in a university lecture theatre, you're more likely not to be really engaged and sucked in to the misinformation, disinformation, the lies that were peddled supposedly by the No campaign. I think this is really offensive, Andrew. And just so the viewers can see, this is a grab that Patricia Karvelas had when she interviewed Warren Mundine on the night of the referendum.
There were many things that your campaign said that weren't true. Do you regret taking that approach?
I reject what you just said.
I mean, that's so offensive. Taking it as a fact that the No campaign had told lies and seriously, Patricia Karvelas, get over yourself. People voted against the Voice for very sound reasons. There was another meltdown on another of our publicly funded broadcasts. This again meant to be neutral, impartial. This time it was former Olympian and politician Nova Peris on the SBS. Here she is.
Australia has pulled the shutters down and said, we choose not to see you, we choose not to hear you.
I mean, that's such an inflammatory message, Sophie, and so false. I mean, we have 11 Aboriginal MPs in Parliament. One of them is this Aboriginal woman, for instance, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who we listened to very carefully, the No campaign leader. But, spreading that message by some in the media that, isn't that really toxic, saying that this country is racist and heartless and this proves it?
It's pretty disgraceful stuff, Andrew. I mean, I was watching SBS on Saturday night and was nearly falling off my chair seeing what was unfolding there with Marcia Langton described as a national treasure. Some of this stuff that went to air over on the ABC, I saw Laura Tingle ask one of the Indigenous MPs if, I'm paraphrasing here, if this resounding no vote meant that Australians didn't love Indigenous Australians. It was something to that effect. Do they feel like they are not loved? I think what was happening on Saturday night was the left knew this was going down and they prepared their talking points, and their talking points were that this was full of misinformation, disinformation and lies, and they are still struggling to come to terms with, Andrew, that Australians did not want this. And when they finally wake up and realise perhaps the mainstream media is completely offbeat here, they are not listening to what mainstream Australians believe, and that is they did not want this voice to Parliament.
That is exactly correct. It really is that simple. They looked at it and they didn't like it. They liked it a year ago. They didn't like it when they looked closer. Now, but if you really want a dangerous take on race politics here, Sophie, I was shocked to hear this from race-baiting Senator Lydia Thorpe. She was siding with the Palestinians, particularly with the Hamas-led Gaza Strip, Hamas being a terrorist group, after the slaughter and rape of Jews a week ago, and said Aborigines here had the same right to stand against colonialists, as she put it. Here she is.
Colonisation and dispossession is not a thing of the past you just read up in the history books. They are ongoing violent processes happening right now. You have the responsibility to support Palestinians standing against it, just as you have the responsibility to support First Nations people here standing against it.
This is so inflammatory, Sophie. It's almost like, whipping up, accidentally or not, an intifada in our streets over the Aboriginal issue. I mean, this debate now is getting right out of hand.
Well, it is, Andrew, and if I remember correctly, Lydia Thorpe didn't go on Q&A last night because she said she was still receiving threats and she felt unsafe. Some of these comments that people in the public are making are pretty damn offensive, Andrew, and it just stirs up this angst and this whiplash, which is completely unnecessary. But Lydia Thorpe she's very outspoken, as we all know. She generates headlines. And sometimes I wonder if she's just saying these things, Andrew, to get a reaction, because then it ends up in the media and we all start talking about it.
I can't help but think you're absolutely correct there. I would hate to think she's actually wanting the war that she keeps talking about, because in the end, it won't just her be being frightened. Whether these threats are real or not, I don't know how genuine they are. A lot of people will be terrified, because that is the last thing you want. We should be talking it down, not talking it up, and that is a senator in our parliament. It's just extraordinary. Sophie Elsworth, thank you so much indeed for your time.